Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today at this incredibly special webinar that touches many women's hearts. This is one of our weekly Be Women webinars where we connect, we share, we learn what's important, what is happening to all of us, especially in these very challenging moments of, in many of the cases, in isolation. But these are unique opportunities for all of us to actually reimagine our future, and not only personally, to develop us personally as an opportunity to grow professionally, to learn, and most important, to grow and determine as global citizens what do we stand for, what do we care for. So I'm Laura Jadorukoch, a lawyer in the state of New York and Argentina, very passionate about using business and the markets as a force for good and issues about gender. Our webinar will last around 50 to 60 minutes, and it's OXFAM, Unpaid and Underpaid Care Work, the Global Inequality. OXFAM, for more than like 50 years, is in existence, started practically at the Second World War to really create a difference in the lives of actually lasting solutions to fight against poverty. And what they have done is really amazing. And our speakers today are amazing speakers today. Diya, Dutta, Oxfam Manager Research for Policy Research and Campaigns, because Oxfam does a lot of campaigns that really are very effective. And Anam, Parvez, Gender Justice Research Leader at Oxfam. So these two ladies are so passionate about this subject and so determined to make a difference, especially now after COVID. We just need to get going because poverty is an epidemic in the epidemic. So we need to move over. So what is Be Women? We are a global network of women entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs that seek to balance purpose and profits in the market towards a caring economy. And Oxfam is all about caring economy. And a caring economy is a genuine care for people, nature as our top priority, where our values as our respect, dignity, collaboration are our driving forces. So one last thing before we get started is the Be Women empowering move that I want you to all be energized, and is to move your shoulders back, your chin up, your eyes that twinkle, and with a wide smile that illuminates everything around you, so that we get things done. I would like to pass the word to Anam and Diya that will tell you from their hearts why are they so passionate about this, and then we'll go into our presentations.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, everyone. Thank you also to Be Women for organizing this and inviting us to speak on such a pertinent issue, even more so now. So I guess why I'm passionate. So care has really become a focus area of my research and my work. Firstly, partly because as someone working on gender justice issues, it's become increasingly obvious that to address gender inequalities, we have to address inequalities in care and its undervaluation. I'm also really passionate about the issue because I've grown up in a highly patriarchal society and really witnessed firsthand how, invisible but essential care work is. Also how it isn't seen as work. It's seen as women's innate responsibilities. It's used oftentimes as a justification for violence. And also how deeply embedded and resistant to change beliefs are around this. And just also to reflect that, after being introduced to the discipline or subdiscipline of feminist economics, I realized how invisible care was from the economic discipline itself. So it never once came up in my 3 years studying economics at a leading UK university. So I guess should I turn to Diya maybe to respond to that, and then we can kick off.
Thanks, Anam. You've actually taken the words out of my mouth, because both of us come from South Asia, and yes, we come from deeply patriarchal societies, and unpaid care work is a part and parcel of our lives. We don't talk about it, but it's omnipresent in our lives. I started working on care back in 2005 when I joined Oxford University for my master's program, because I was going to work on a thesis on old age, aging issues, and care was a major part of that. That's where my journey started, and I have been working on it academically and now professionally for many years, and looked at many facets of it. It's tremendous. I mean, in fact, this pandemic has thrown up such massive disruptions in women's lives, especially in countries like India, other South Asian countries, where already the burden of care work was just enormous, and with the pandemic, it's just unimaginable what women are going through with reduced incomes and much higher levels of unpaid care work that's on their shoulders now. That it's it's in some ways it's heart wrenching, but it's also very eye opening to see what's going on. Anam?
Thanks, Diya. Yeah, agree with all of that, and hopefully we'll touch on some of those aspects today as well. Great. So Laura has the presentation ready. So just before I get into the content, just a bit in terms of what we're thinking around the structure. So I'll start by spending about 10 to 15 minutes giving you a brief overview of our global inequality report titled Time to Care, which you see the kind of title page up there in front of you. And I'm, hopefully will complement a lot of the work you all might be doing and provide a good basis for discussion, cross-fertilization of ideas and findings. Throughout, I will be touching on how the pandemic is further exposing and exacerbating inequalities, and why it's important, as Laura said at the start, now more than ever, to really envision a new alternative, caring, feminist economy that really values work and well-being over wealth and profit. And then I'll turn to Diya for the second half of the presentation to share highlights from the India Inequality Report, which also focused on care and how the issues raised are being impacted by the pandemic and its response in India. And then we'll reconvene to briefly discuss recommendations, and then hand over to Laura to share discussions and any questions or reflections from you or anyone joining us through Facebook Live as well. So yes, without further ado, just a bit of background on the Inequality Report. So every year since 2013, Oxfam has released a report to highlight the scale and impact of extreme global inequality around the time that world leaders and billionaires gather in the snowy mountains of Davos for the World Economic Forum. So this year, the report published in January focused on unpaid and underpaid care and time poverty as both the driver and product of economic inequality. And this report really reflects a long journey we've been on within Oxfam to really integrate our fiscal justice and wider gender justice, programming and thinking into our wider inequality campaign to recognize and better reflect how economic inequality really needs to be understood as gendered, and how with this understanding, the solutions then become much more focused. So, the thinking that is contained within the report, is not new necessarily, but really represents the strength of allyship with feminist economists, builds a lot on their work, on the work of feminist activists and women's rights movements, and the long years of work by many others. So just, I guess, top line, what we're trying to illustrate, still on the slide, Laura, that, what we're trying to illustrate through this report is how the current sexist and extractive economic system, which values wealth over work and well-being, is fueling a dual crisis, one of economic inequality, but also of care around the world, from Uganda all the way to the UK, and how this is hitting women and girls the hardest, particularly those at the intersection of different inequalities, and then outlining what our vision for an alternative economy looks like, building on the tireless work of many of those that I mentioned already. So next slide, please. So our economic system is deeply flawed, and we try to illustrate this through kind of two ends of the spectrum. At the one end of this broken system, the wealthy elite continue to amass great fortunes, irrespective of whether they add value to society or not. Our headline stat from the report was that a small group of billionaires, around 2,000 and mostly men, have more wealth between them than 60% of the world's population. Another way of putting it, if you could click again, Laura, that if everyone were to sit on their wealth piled up in $100 bills, most of humanity would be sitting on the floor. Meanwhile, Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates would be sitting in outer space. So, these inequalities, it's important to reflect, particularly within the given context, that they are resilient to crises, shocks, and pandemics. Analysis shows that the economic crisis caused by COVID could push over 500 million people into poverty. Yet, what we're seeing is that since the start of this pandemic, billionaires have profited to the tune of $308 billion, with Jeff Bezos poised to become the world's first trillionaire in the next 6 years. Next, please. Again. Thank you. What's happening at the other end of the system? Women continue to own 50% less wealth and earn 23% less than men. Many of us are familiar with these statistics. Meanwhile, each day, women and girls provide 12.5 billion hours of unpaid care and domestic work, looking after children, cooking, collecting water, all without recognition, with many more hours also worked in paid care for very low or poverty wages. Next, please. And we know, this work is a critical social and economic good. We have all needed care at some point in our lives. And COVID is highlighting, once again, just how essential care work is to our economy, health, and survival. And I find this narrative around, us being in an economic shutdown to actually be a bit of a misnomer and just inaccurate if we really consider the huge amounts of unpaid work, unpaid care work that is happening, and that women particularly are doing overtime at home as teachers, cleaners, cooks, and nurses. So while many sectors have been scaled down or put on hold, the care sector is actually in overdrive because we cannot similarly press pause on the life-sustaining work that is really holding up our households, communities, care homes, hospitals. And OXFAM estimated for the report that unpaid care work, now this is pre-COVID, contributes to the global economy at least by very conservative estimates, and it's just a monetary measure. We know that we can't put a number to all facets of it, but by very conservative estimates, it's $10.8 trillion a year, or 3 times the size of the world's tech industry. Next, please. Now, the UN has projected a close to 1% decrease in GDP as a result of COVID this year. Now, if these calculations of unpaid care and domestic work were counted, and bear in mind that they don't yet reflect the increases in care work during the pandemic, GDP would actually increase by 8%. Yet, not only is it not being captured in these statistics, it is being taken for granted. It is invisible in policy making, undervalued and underinvested in as a result by governments, businesses, and communities alike. So next slide, please. A closer look at who cares. We all know that women undertake the majority, 3/4 of all unpaid care. In particular, though, it is women and girls living in poverty in rural areas and the poorest slums, and from socially disadvantaged groups that shoulder the greatest responsibilities. So for example, in rural and low-income communities, our research shows that women spend up to 14 hours a day doing unpaid care work. And this is because they are less able to afford domestic help, have less access to time-saving infrastructure, such as electricity and water, and basic services such as child and healthcare. In these communities, it's also girls rather than boys who support or substitute for the unpaid care activities done by their mothers. And what's happening under COVID is that, again, women, particularly those living in poverty from these groups, are spending even longer hours on essential care tasks outside the home, such as shopping at the market, getting medicine, queuing for water, all which also put them at a higher risk of exposure to the disease. With school closures alone, 320 million children will miss out on free school meals, and it will likely again be women who step up to fill this gap or risk having their children go hungry. So in the paid care sector, it's a very similar story. Women are overrepresented. They make up 2/3 of the workforce. In Latin America, as much as 92% of domestic workers are women. And they are also predominantly from marginalized groups, migrants, racial and ethnic minorities. And their, paid care workers are also paid significantly less than workers in other sectors that require similar levels of skills, and also lack access to labor and social protections. And under the pandemic, we've seen how, paid care workers, predominantly women, are also more likely to be exposed to the virus. So in Italy and Spain, COVID-19 infections among female healthcare workers, now this is just preliminary evidence of this, but they are twice that than their male counterparts, the levels of infections among female health workers. In addition, unpaid carers and informal paid carers are increasingly looking after vulnerable people without any personal protective equipment. And evidence from the UK and the US is showing how inequality based on gender intersect with those based on income, ethnicity, race, and migrant status to leave certain groups even worse off. Next, please. So what are the implications? These heavy and unequal levels of care work really trap women in a self-reinforcing cycle of time, income, and voice poverty across their life cycle, while at the same time, they enable men's dominance in wealth, economics, and politics. And this really drives the gendered economic inequalities that we're seeing, which are then being exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. So just a few examples of that. Unequal care responsibilities set in from an early age because of gender norms, leading to higher school dropout rates for girls than boys. As women enter peak productive and reproductive years, their likelihood of suffering from extreme poverty increases from being 4% higher than men to 22% higher than men, mainly because of unequal childcare responsibilities. Globally, 42% of women of working age, compared with only 6% of men, said they were outside of the paid labor force, primarily because of unpaid care responsibilities. And we're already seeing how women are having to forego paid work to take on increasing unpaid care responsibilities in the context of the pandemic as well. And, prioritizing unpaid care work or taking part-time and informal forms of employment to then be able to better manage care responsibilities, then make women less able to contribute towards social security and accumulate wealth, making them poorer and more vulnerable in old age. And we're already seeing this play out in the context of the pandemic. In low-income countries, 92% of women work in precarious and informal employment. And among informal workers, they are overrepresented in sectors hardest hit by the pandemic. And overstretched care systems, closures of schools and services mean that women, particularly those living in poverty and precarity, are compensating by taking longer shifts in poorer conditions of employment, as well as doing additional unpaid care work at home, which is why we call it the kind of double burden. This also extends to paid care. In Latin American countries. 36% of domestic workers are living below the poverty line, compared to 26% of the total urban workforce. So what all of this means is that women in poverty do more hours of unpaid and paid care, and thus stay poor because they care more. And that is hugely unjust. And the pandemic and its response actually risks pushing women even deeper into time, income, and voice poverty, because once again, it's becoming this invisible sector that, while in rhetoric, we're seeing there's some recognition of it, but in practice, we're seeing that that's really not the case. And actually, it's again becoming a heavily exploited sector. So next. So carers are not only being locked into cycles of time and income poverty, but they are also locked out of solutions, or what I call voice poverty. But being physically and economically out of sight makes this work largely invisible in measures of economic activity and puts carers out of reach of legal protections, vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. They are also unable to be a part of spaces where decisions are being taken because of being time poor. In Bolivia, 42% of women said in a national time use survey that care work is the biggest obstacle to their political participation. And what are we seeing currently in the context of the pandemic? That only 30% of CEOs working in global health organizations are men and just are women, and just 5% are women from low and middle income countries, which has huge implications for COVID response, recovery, decision making, and they will be disproportionately impacted by those decisions. They're also relegated to the private sphere with less decision-making power. Women are told, economics is not for you, while men are chiefly responsible for economic decisions. And this then becomes a vicious cycle of women not having the power or agency to affect change, while privileged men continue to be in the driving seat, making decisions that benefit them, extracting profit and building power. Next.
Yeah, and what's amazing is that as of today, more than $3 trillion have been spent in the last month just for COVID.
Sorry, I didn't catch that last bit.
Yeah, that more than $3 trillion have been spent by governments in the world on just in the last few months.
Yeah. And to think that, there's the 50% of the population is who is being disproportionately impacted by those decisions are not in the driving seat, let alone even on the negotiating tables. So that is hugely concerning and alarming. And just to say that this is not an accident, right? And we know this, and I've mentioned this, that it really is a result of a historically sexist and extractive economic system that has been valuing the wrong things, that is steeped in harmful gender norms, that consider women to be subordinate to men, consider care work to be unskilled, really a cost rather than an investment. And then therefore embedded in such a model then, government policies are going to be, and these response and recovery packages for that matter, are going to be inherently gender biased. You know, we're seeing that already that, you know, governments have been slow to or largely blind to recognizing care work as essential work, as well as the needs of care workers. You know, in the UK, that has been gaining traction in the rhetoric. An immigration bill has just been passed last week through the House of Commons, according to which many of the paid care workers would be considered unskilled and refused employment or entry into the UK. Meanwhile, you know, we have governments like the US who've been quick to agree to massive bailouts for airlines and fossil fuel industries, which are actually doing the opposite of caring for our environment. Next.
Yeah, we have to say that the Be Women, we're really working on the care economy to really get everybody to learn about it. So this is so much close to everybody, women's heart, what you're talking about.
Great. I'm really glad to hear that. I'm just wrapping up. I'm conscious of time, so I'm getting to the end now. But just want to say that, you know, and this is something we touched on in our report, which was released pre-COVID, but we did want to reflect on the fact that, you know, times are going to get tougher, you know, and along with COVID, there are additional challenges that are going to be thrown up in, you know, in the next decade or so. In the next 10 years, we know that an additional 100 million older people and children will need care. Climate-related shocks and disasters such as floods and droughts are on the increase, with women's workload sometimes doubling or tripling when income-generating conditions deteriorate. And in the next 5 years alone, 2.4 billion people will be living in areas without enough water, and women and girls are already having to walk even further to find water. So this is a situation of compounded crises where, you know, COVID is but one. And this is why it is more urgent now than ever to really address these inequalities. So next. So, you know, this must, but also it, you know, it can change. So good quality public services and care infrastructure such as water, electricity, and social care really paid for through progressive taxes. A lot of times, you know, what we're asked is, who's going to pay for it? But you'll find that there actually is a lot of room in public coffers. It's just a matter of reprioritizing. But these measures are essential to tackle the worsening care and inequality crisis. You know, OXFAM'S research in low-income communities in Zimbabwe showed just how powerful some of these measures are, that, you know, access to water could reduce the time that women spend on care work by 4 hours a day. Now that's equivalent to a full-time job a year in parts of Europe. And that these investments would really impact women living in poverty the most. And I think Diya will touch on this, but in parts of India, women living in households below the poverty line benefited the most from government water and clean cooking fuel schemes. And just the last slide. And, you know, the demand for a more caring economy is already expanding into movements across the world. And it is beginning to affect change in narratives, certainly, and also in some programs and policies. So one thing we try to do in the report is really make visible the changes that are happening. You know, a few examples, and you may already be, you know, familiar with them, but Uruguay's groundbreaking national integrated care system has really led the way in enshrining the right to be cared for, as well as the right to care in law. In the context of the pandemic, we are seeing you know, some green shoots through the cracks of our system. We're seeing more solidarity initiatives, community support, local organizing. You know, in the UK alone, which is where I'm sitting, over 3,400 local mutual aid associations have sprung up. While in Chile, feminist groups have launched an emergency plan collectively organizing for the care of populations at risk. But these efforts need to be backed up with systemic political and economic change that is transformative and is really, as well as being informed by science, also informed by justice and women's voices. Two good examples of this are the feminist Green New Deal and Hawaii's historic feminist economic recovery plan. And both of these initiatives or plans movements in some ways are actually calling for new types of leadership that really center the voices of women from marginalized communities, caregivers, and those that represent feminist movements in COVID-19 response and recovery. And they demand that economies be reoriented from extractive industries towards investments in care and other green sectors funded through progressive taxation. So I will stop there and we will return to recommendations later.
Well, thank you. That was really amazing. And Diya has written a report that really needs, one second, I'm looking for the PowerPoint. Yeah, so 1 second. So that is a must read for everybody on the line, because it's really a great work of an analysis of what matters for the society. Here we go. Do you see the PowerPoint now?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So I'm going to go, I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to be a little faster. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the inequality in India and how it's rising, which is what is worrisome. Then go into a little bit about gender inequality in India. I mean, just to set the stage before we talk about unpaid care work. So we talk a little bit about the different kinds of gender inequalities in the country. And then we'll talk about unpaid care work. And then I really want to talk about the intersection between, or the connection between unpaid care work and violence against women and girls, because that's the study that we did this year, the report and the India Inequality report focused on, which was looking at how, I mean, increased levels of unpaid care work can actually lead to higher levels of violence that women face in their lives. And then, of course, we'll come back to discussing the recommendations, but I will end with a little bit about the impact on women and girls in terms of unpaid care work burden and violence in the light of the pandemic. So Laura, if we can proceed, please. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. So World Economic Forum's Inclusive Development Index indicates that 6 out of 10 Indians live on less than $3.2 a day. And this was pre-COVID. In the aftermath of the pandemic, it's estimated that in addition, 104 million Indians are expected to be pushed into poverty, while 12 million will be pushed into extreme poverty. So, I mean, the numbers are actually staggering in India. The wealth, I mean, I don't know how much our stories are being carried into the international media, but the plight of the migrant workers is just absolutely heart-wrenching. The wealth of just a small number of 9 billionaires is equivalent to the wealth of the bottom 50% of the population. India has 1.6% share among the top 1% of the global wealth holders, which is about 827,000 adults. And the wealth of the top 1% has increased by 46%, whereas the wealth of the bottom 50% has increased by a mere 3%, which is just showing the starkness of the inequality in our country. Next slide, please. So just to put this into context, the top 10% of the population, the wealthy, hold 74.3% of the national wealth, whereas the top 1% hold about 42.5% of the national wealth. And Gini, which is the Gini coefficient, is the measure of inequality, has, if you look between 2008 and 2019, has increased significantly, which is the worrying part, that it's not just that we have staggering levels of inequality in the country, but that inequality is rising further. The other part of the story of this wealth generation is that it's not gender equal. So only 5 women billionaires in the Forbes 2019 list constitute about 4.7% of the Indian billionaires. So the billionaire club is essentially an all boys club, almost, and with very few women in that. Next slide, please. So now let's talk a little bit about the gender inequality in India. So if you look at female labor force participation, urban women have remained largely stable in the workforce participation. This was, of course, pre-COVID. With COVID, things have been disrupted majorly, and we don't have the numbers as yet, but it is estimated that it has disrupted women's participation in a massive way, with job losses, reduction in wages, etc., etc. But rural female labor force participation fell down from 35.8% to 24.6%, which is quite a steep come down. On average, women tend to spend a disproportionately greater amount of time, often twice as much than men, on household care work and 5 times more than men on childcare. The unequal distribution, and I would echo what Anam is saying, that the unequal distribution of unpaid care work allows men to participate in the labor market, participate in political decision making, social participation, etc., whereas it limits women's capacity to do the same, even though men and women in the household spend the same time in terms of total hours working. In fact, there are estimates done by economists which show that if you actually considered unpaid care work as productive labor, then the amount of time women put into to perform productive labor is much higher than what men perform in India. Next slide, please. Care work is, so this is a little bit of analysis behind what is the care situation vis-a-vis the political, economic understanding or lack of acknowledgement in the country. So care work is not accounted for in national systems of accounting in the country because it is essentially considered as an act of love and not as a productive labor, which is the biggest challenge to making it visible within the workforce and work participation calculations. And unpaid care work leads to material deprivation of an income-poor household on account of loss in earnings due to time poverty, which negatively impacts consumption. There needs to be definitive policy actions aimed at reducing gender inequalities arising from unequal distribution of care work. Next slide, please. So just what do women do in India, if we want to put a number to that? So women and girls in India put in 3.26 billion hours of unpaid care work each and every day, which is equivalent to $251 billion a year. And that's roughly about 10% of the Indian GDP. And the time spent on unpaid care work by gender, if you look at this graph, is very lopsided. I mean, in rural areas, men spend only 32 minutes per day on unpaid care work, whereas women spend 291 minutes per day on unpaid care work. And in the urban areas, men spend even less, 29 minutes, whereas women spend even more, 312 minutes. In countries where women undertake 5 times as much care work as men, they're estimated to earn 40% of what men make for the same work. Next slide, please. So now I want to talk a little bit about the intersection between unpaid care work and gender-based violence or violence against women and girls. And so Oxfam India did a household care survey of 1,000 households in 2019. And the findings around the connection between unpaid care work and violence against women and girls was very startling. What I mean, the main message that came out was that the greater the acceptability of beating a woman, the greater was the time that she spent on paid and unpaid care, and the lesser the time she spent on leisure activities or well-being activities like taking care of her health, taking care of her children, etc., etc. Next slide, please. So the household care survey had some staggering numbers. It found linkages between women's unpaid care work and gender-based violence. For instance, 42.2% of women who fail to fetch water or firewood for the household, and 41.2% of women who fail to prepare meals for the males in the family were physically beaten. That was the level of acceptability of violence against women who did not perform their unpaid care work duties. The survey, as Anam mentioned, also found that government interventions such as provisioning of clean drinking water and cooking gas had a positive effect on reducing the time spent on unpaid care work, especially for those women who were poorer or lived in more remote areas. For example, tribal women who lived in more remote areas with less accessibility to public services. Dalit women also who are very poor also found it that they benefited more than, say, upper caste Hindu women if these services were provided. The other reason is that there's been increasing nuclearization of families even in rural areas. So earlier, the traditional large joint families are, sorry, the next slide, please. The large joint families are shrinking, and there are fewer women to share the burden of unpaid care work. The young girls are, there's been a success of a drive to put children, boys and girls into school, which is a good thing, but the fallout is that earlier girls used to help out their mothers at home with unpaid care work. Now these girls are in school, so the burden of unpaid care work has increased exponentially for these women in the households. There's also the issue of increased migration of men outside their villages and small towns for work. And interestingly, the survey found that women spend 40 minutes more on paid work and 1 hour less on care work, implying that the absence of men positively impacts a woman's remunerative capacity. But in the aftermath of the COVID, where there's now a mass exodus of people going back to their villages, we already have estimates of women's unpaid care work burden increasing exponentially, coupled with lower or no wages, making their lives extremely difficult. So, I mean, there's on one hand loss of income, on the other hand, there is increased burden of unpaid care work, which just makes them that much more vulnerable to food shocks, financial shocks, making them vulnerable to violence, a lot of things. Next slide, please. So now I want to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID on the lives of women in India. It's undoubtedly, this pandemic has shaken the world, bringing it to its knees. The economic crisis that the pandemic posed onto all of us is arguably one of the, there's been none like this before, certainly not in this century. In India, almost 1 in every 2 households has experienced a decline in income. While we battle the COVID-19 and solidarity, we need to assess the damages that it brings with itself. And as we survey the same, we need to look at the gender differential impact of the pandemic as it has on all of us. And that, by that, I don't just mean in terms of whether women are more susceptible, as Anam was saying, because they are in the front line of caregiving jobs, paid caregiving jobs, whether they're more susceptible to the virus itself or not. Because in some ways in India, it seems, I mean, there were some estimates at one time which said that women were less prone to catching the virus than men, or the mortality rates were higher amongst men than women. But that's not really the sum total of the issue. There are much deeper structural problems that we need to address, and the gender differential impact of the pandemic is in terms of job cuts, decline in income, increase in unpaid care work, and domestic violence, to name a few. So India's GDP could permanently lose 4% due to the COVID crisis. According to the World Bank estimate, GDP growth can be as low as 1.5%, lowest since the economic reform started in 1991. Citigroup has done an estimation for the global economic impact that coronavirus bears along with gender disaggregation of the same. But unfortunately, such a study does not exist for India. So what about the labor force? I mean, what is happening there? What we do know that is that unemployment rate for women was already as high as 18% before the lockdown. While the overall figure of men and women stood at 7%, this has increased to 24%. So 24% of the workforce, men and women combined, is now unemployed post the pandemic. A study by the Center for Monitoring of Indian Economy, CIMIE, shows that in 2018, out of the 11 million jobs lost, 8.8 million jobs were accounted for by women, and only men lost only 2.2 million jobs. This gives us a fair idea of how job cuts negatively impact women more than men. With 70% men in the informal sector, the government survey called the Periodic Labor Force Survey of 2017-18, it is not surprising that women are more concerned about job loss than men. The adversely affected industries under the current lockdown are agriculture, trade, hotels, restaurants, and other services where women are predominantly present. In agriculture, 73.2% of female workers are engaged in agriculture compared to 55% of male workers. A majority of 44% of women are enrolled in other service activities compared to only 22% of men. Further, for the same work that men perform, they are paid more than women, and hence with less work available, women are going to be more vulnerable during this situation than men. It is estimated that in the month of April alone, 122 million jobs were lost, of which 17 million were women alone. This implies that the unemployment for women rose by an additional 15% from the pre-lockdown state number of 18%. This increase in unemployment of women can result in a loss to India's GDP of about 8% or about 218 billion US dollars. So what happens? I mean, does violence increase? Does it decrease? What happens, or does it remain the same in this pandemic? There are lots of reports coming out saying that violence has increased. In India, 38% of health workers are women. Women also account for 83.4% of nurses and midwives. Women are already in the front line in the care industry, facing low pay and poor working conditions. Only recently we came across stories of a couple of female health workers who died because they were forced to reuse the personal protective equipment that had been given to them by the hospitals, and they got contaminated and they contracted the virus and they couldn't survive it. But whether one is employed or not, the responsibility of unpaid care work on women has undeniably increased with the closure of schools, daycares, and places of work. According to OECD estimates, women already spend 6 hours in unpaid care work every day. This is pre-COVID, while men spent a meager 52 minutes. The number is argued to have shot up considerably during the lockdown, irrespective of whether a woman currently holds a job or not. So I already spoke about, the findings from the household care survey, where it showed that there's extremely high levels of acceptance of violence against women who do not perform their unpaid care duties. In our inequality report, we also stated that women's unpaid care work is equal to 3.1% of the GDP, or about 84.3 billion US dollars. The story about the violence story is kind of additionally corroborated by the National Family Health Survey 4, which is the latest National Family Health Survey, that 14.5% of girls dropped out of school because they were required for household work. This is pre-COVID. Now with schools shut for long periods of time, boys and girls have dropped out, but there is a looming fear that once the schools reopen, a lot of the poor girl children will no longer go back to school because the families have reduced income, they have higher burdens of unpaid care work. So they will pull the girls out of school and they will make them either perform paid labor or perform work at home, and they will miss out on education, which also does lead to early marriage, violence, domestic violence, and the whole series of things that come into consideration. Um, Spending more time at home has other ill effects on women, like increase in domestic violence. Uh, uh, so the National Commission for Women kind of supported the findings that came out of our household care survey, where it showed that the cases of domestic violence since the lockdown has increased exponentially. Within the first 4.5 months of 2020, domestic violence cases have already reached half of the number of cases in 2019, which is worrisome to say the least. And when we account into the fact that according to the National Family Health Survey, less than 1% of women sought help for domestic violence, the number of reported cases will become even more disturbing. So we don't have numbers, unfortunately, at this point of time of what, I mean, domestic violence or violence per se is hugely underreported in the country. But there are estimates that it's going to be rising exponentially in this period of extended strict lockdown, because men are home, they are frustrated, they've lost their jobs. Women, whatever little gains they had made in terms of income empowerment, I mean, financial empowerment they're losing that, etc. So they're just very vulnerable. So I will stop on the recommendations. Laura, would you like to take this forward?
Thank you. This is really very, very interesting, and you know, there's a lot of questions that we could ask, but I think the most important is that there's a sense of urgency to really get things going. But how does change happen? Because you know, we pre-COVID there was maybe a path to change. Now post-COVID, where are we, and how are we going to move forward, and what can be done?
Anam, would you like to take it first? Anam, you're muted.
Sorry, I forgot to take myself off mute. Yeah, that's a really pertinent question. And I think that one of the things that's quite important, and I'm hopeful, I should say, because I think that, as I mentioned, the narrative in some parts of the world is really beginning to change around recognizing care work. And that's one thing that the pandemic has done, is really shone a bright light on this work that is happening, you know, oftentimes behind closed door, at great cost to women's health, their time, their economic and political opportunities, but is considered unessential, invisible, and taken for granted. So I think that one of the things that's really key is to shift, and the starting point really is to shift norms around what is considered essential and valuable work. And we found that even pre-COVID, a lot of our efforts, without really working on shifting norms alongside some of the other initiatives, was a pretty futile exercise. So we found, for instance, that without continuous work on social norms, you know, the new water systems that we were helping install could actually lead to women spending more time on care, because there were still those social expectations that, you know, women need to be doing this work, and because it's now easier to do this work and easier to wash clothes more often, they should be doing that. Or we were seeing that, you know, housework was being redistributed to other women or girls in the household. And I think there's a lot of kind of research around women's economic empowerment that also points to how changes in, how policy changes are insufficient without changes in on norms as well. The other thing that we've learned is that, national level policy change can really be slower or difficult. But what we found is, we've seen a lot of success working together locally with municipal governments, community leaders, women's rights organizations. And we found that progressive local governments have actually motivated each other. So this kind of horizontal scaling we've seen happening. So as an example, 8 local governments in I think it was the Philippines passed the Women's Economic Empowerment and Care Ordinances, which are laws that made it mandatory to address unpaid care in all planning, budgeting, and programming activities. I think it's really important to work across disciplines, across sectors. So multi-stakeholder initiatives are really important to achieve policy change and social norms change. It's also really important to involve men and boys in these conversations, to engage them as role models and care champions, to really demonstrate the benefits of sharing care, but also making visible where it's already happening. And then I think as academics and development practitioners, I think what's really important and what the discipline of feminist economics has done really well is to really make unpaid and paid care more visible in our research, in our programming, and also, bringing the voices of carers and making those and amplifying those. So I think, those are just some reflections. And I agree, it's a really, it is a tough time, but I think there are some opportunities, and we really need to seize this moment that we're in, where finally a lot of the work that's been happening behind closed doors that has been considered invisible is now suddenly very visible. So really to use that opportunity to kind of make sure that this narrative change is not just a narrative change, but that it also then translates into practice and policies. And
So Diya, you want to mention some of the questions, and also I want to ask you if you would like to answer also the question about GDP. Why is it that care work has never been added to GDP as a value when it's so valuable? Diya,
yeah, it's a very pertinent question. So our national systems of National Sample Survey Organization, which is the main body which does employment, unemployment surveys, productive labor surveys, etc. They actually have the category of measuring the unpaid labor that women perform in their homes, in their family farms, etc. But it is currently considered as voluntary work and not as paid productive work. Sorry, it's not considered as productive work. So one of the recommendations that Oxfam India has been making for the last 2 years is that the International Conference for Labor Statisticians have now accepted unpaid care work as productive labor, productive work within their definitions of work. And we are advocating that Government of India should also adopt that, because Government of India is a participant in that Conference of Labor Statisticians, that we should also be adapting that definition of productive work into our systems, because we already have the setup. It's just that we're not considering it as productive work at the moment. But this has been traditional, because in a very patriarchal society, social norms, once again, define division of labor in such a way that it doesn't allow women's work in the home to be considered as productive labor. And that's when, it's a combination of socio-cultural and economic and political factors which makes it a lethal combination, making it very difficult to actually pursue with policymakers to make this visible.
I think maybe just adding on that point, Diya, and I think that there is a broader point about this being a key failing of our neoliberal economic model, which is really built on, this premise of, self-interested, autonomous, rational individuals making decisions largely based on, their preferences rather than social determinants in what is considered the monetized markets, which take place in the public sphere. So what it has done is it's really turned a blind eye to non-monetized forms of work and work that goes on in the private sphere. And then linking to Diya's point about gender inequalities, it has also turned a blind eye to these sort of within household, inter-household inequalities and different levels of privilege and power. So I think, again, the work of feminist economists and that whole discipline really emerged from this, recognition that, the neoliberal economics, was had turned a blind eye and had drawn these boundaries around, the market, which meant that whatever wasn't in the traditionally kind of conceived notion of a market was then not work. And so, it's this kind of thinking that is then also informed and shaped these norms around what we consider to be skilled and productive work, like Diya was saying. Even if we have all the tools at hand, I was, working in the World Bank on a social protection program for many years in Pakistan. And one of the things that we were finding was that, we were hearing from people and community members, particularly women, that these conditionalities that were being imposed on them were increasing the time they were spending on caring responsibilities. And this was having a negative impact on, different dimensions of their well-being. But the World Bank wasn't really willing to change at the same time the way that it took that on board and addressed that, because that wasn't, again, it wasn't considered a priority, because it's just, again, those norms which not only exist in communities but also in workplaces and institutions. Sorry, rambled on a bit.
No, I know, but it's very interesting, because if you look at Marx and Adam Smith, for them, care work was reproductive work, so it had no value. That's why you always at the beginning said it's invisible. But the interesting thing is Australia last year did a report, and they analyzed how much, what was the value in the GDP of the caring economy of a domestic work, and it ramped up to practically 50% of the GDP. So imagine if metrics in GDP would include these very valuable contributors to our society, to our well-being. So is there any country now that is actually taking some steps towards it, or already has done this?
So I know that not in kind of in expanding the kind of definition of the GDP itself necessarily, but I know that there are other governments like New Zealand, which are using a different framework altogether. They're using the Living Standards framework to measure progress against, to measure progress, and that it's also informed what is now called their well-being budget. So Oxfam New Zealand has also been involved in that, and it includes indicators on time use, environment, health, income, and also civic engagement. So I think there the thinking has really been that GDP is not, rather than trying to fix a measurement model that is, inherently flawed, maybe we need an alternative measure. So I think that is a really interesting one to follow what's happening with the well-being budget there, and how that is being then kind of used, and how these measures are being used and monitored, and how it's informing policies and practice.
And Diya, do you want to add something else on this topic of GDP? And what about the Northern European countries that have a lot of care policies? Do they include these values in the GDP?
I don't know about countries which have altered their GDP calculations, which include care work, but there are social protection measures that a lot of progressive countries have adopted, which recognize care work as essential service. And at least, I mean, it's visible within the policy framework, which for, I think, a majority of countries around the world is not the case, especially amongst African and South Asian and Latin American countries. It's a problem. I mean, I think that's the way forward, to first recognize within policy circles. And I mean, this is a long drawn discussion of extended SNA, systems of national accounting, which should account for unpaid care work. But not too many countries have actually been able to do something that's productive, that's making this visible.
I think just one other thing to maybe mention is this was initiated by Scotland, and it is called the Wellbeing Alliance, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. It's bringing together different governments in the global, predominantly from the global north for now, that are really committed to adopting well-being measures and embedding them within economic policies. So that's something else that, you know, for those joining in online or otherwise, it might be one to kind of look into. I know that Iceland, Scotland, New Zealand are active members of that initiative, and the idea is to really kind of have a few trendsetters, so to speak, to inspire and to inspire others and show us the way. So yeah.
That is fantastic. So we are at the hour. If you don't mind, each of you just doing a closing remarks so that we can close this with what's next. How will Oxfam take this activity for this action forward to really move the caring economy? And what are your vision in the next 5 years post-COVID?
Anam, you want to go first?
Sure. Next 5 years. I don't know what's happening in a month's time. No, I'm joking about that. Things are moving so quickly that, yeah, what I might say now might not be in the direction that no, it definitely will be the direction. I think Oxfam is very, I can speak of, I think Oxfam globally, but particularly Oxfam in the UK. I mean, we're very, very committed to, you know, the issues that we've just highlighted. We've got a multi-country program called the Women's Economic Empowerment and Care Program that has been working on, you know, addressing inequalities and levels of care work, reducing, redistributing, and what was the third one? Recognizing care work, and also ensuring the representation of carers in economic decision making. So that is ongoing, and I think especially now in the context of COVID, there's various research initiatives, and there's a policy brief that is forthcoming that will collate all of the research that we're doing in a number of different countries, in the US, in the UK, but also in the Philippines, in Ethiopia, in Canada, which looks at what's happening currently. How has COVID really impacted caring responsibilities, and how is the distribution of care now changing within households, or is it changing within households? Because there's anecdotal evidence that because there are more men at home now than ever before, that men are actually realizing how much care work actually gets done, and B, they're also participating. But we really want to test that hypothesis and put some numbers against it. And we will be launching a global campaign together with Promundo, which is a really well-recognized organization that works on promoting men and boys' engagement in care work. So that will be in time for Father's Day. So do keep a lookout for that, and then using that research and the findings to really advocate for national level policies, as governments start to are drafting and coming up with various economic stimulus packages and responses, but also as we're entering into the recovery discussions. So yeah, just what I see in the immediate term. I don't know exactly how this will play out in the next 5 years, but yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so Oxfam India has been traditionally working for many years now on social norms, changing social norms, making them more gender equal. And I think the care work is at the core of that work, especially in this post-pandemic scenario. We actually came out with a charter of demands, a policy brief for the government to make their policies gender sensitive, and we discussed the care work issues and that. There's more work going on. There's going to be a campaign starting on the pandemic and how that's affected women and girls, the whole care issues, the violence issues, the issue of social norms. I mean, are there any positive spin-offs? What are the negative spin-offs? All of that is going to be starting from June 1st. But in terms of recommendations for the government, I think the need of the hour is for gender-sensitive policies that address the increasing unemployment, unpaid care work, and violence that women are facing. I mean, it's a triple whammy in terms of losing jobs, losing income, safety, food safety, increasing their unpaid care burdens, and all of this in cumulatively making them more vulnerable to domestic violence or other kinds of violence in the community, which needs to be addressed definitely in the coming years.
So thank you very much. It's been really wonderful, ladies. It's really an honor to have you on the line and explaining all that you shared. We will make sure this gets massively distributed, because this knowledge has to go out. Women especially have to take conscious about the unpaid and underpaid work of women. And so on this note, I just want to say that we have a few webinars coming up tomorrow. One is about how COVID how can you live with COVID and great relationships? This is more of a self-help initiative, as well as another one, self-help, that is all, is it safe to be me during and post-COVID? And then biomimicry, so that we can connect what we're doing as individuals and nature. On this note, I want to thank you all, and have a super day, and we'll connect very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you. Bye-bye.